Welcome back to Cards and Comics, and today I am going to be doing my first hobby talk video where I specifically go over comic book collecting. And it's a big part of what I do, even though maybe it's not as represented on my channel as I would like it to be. In general, my comic book collecting is really focused on two things, or three things really. It's I started out collecting Spider-Man. It's what a lot of people do. It's a very common thing for people to do. And so when I got back into comic book collecting, again around 2004, 2005, mostly, I was doing a little bit before that. And I had collected comic books as a kid, so 85, 86, I had Watchmen, I read Watchmen. I had a lot of the Frank Miller books, and I was really into Daredevil. So that was my kid, my growing up as a kid, and then I was into Comico. So I was really big into Robotech on TV as a kid, and then the Comico books, and so I was into just Comico as a company. It was really interesting to me that there was non-DC and Marvel books, and then I would get those comic book magazines, and just read about all these cool indie comics. Now, I never went to a comic book store as a kid, never did. There wasn't one near me, and so I never had the chance to go into a store and pick up some of those books I read about. So as I got older, and I started really getting into those books, and I remember Valiant. I was really interested in Valiant, but I didn't have the ability to find those books growing up too much. Even later on, when they had peaked and dropped and all that, it's still interesting to me because I never read those books, and they actually were really good to read. Some good stories back in the day. But the second thing, so Spider-Man was kind of how I started. Love Spider-Man. And then, again, the next thing when I started getting back into comic books was, and I was already collecting cards. I knew about card grading, and then I saw that comic books are graded, and the first thing I thought about was vintage comics. So I spent a long time just kicking the tires on vintage comic books, and I obviously started with Spider-Man books, from Silver Age, but then I went back and found a dealer who I talked to for a long time, and he convinced me to buy a few books that were Golden Age, and they were both Alex Schomburg covers. I've shown them off in some different videos, but the first one I bought was Captain America 27, which is the classic motorcycle cover. And since then I've been an Alex Schomburg collector. I've added LB Cole, so that's where I started into the vintage comic books. Now, my third thing, I collect really since the beginning was variant comic books. And it appealed to me because I come from the world of sports cards. And I know I've talked about this a little bit with Marvel cards. But it made a lot of sense to me that variant comic book covers were rarer and would hold more value compared to the standard cover. Now, it's a lot more complex than that in the comic book world than the sports card world. Comic book cover art is the subject, the style of art. I mean, there's just tons of things that go into it. Into words, print runs and those, just it's on and on how difficult it is to determine if a variant is going to be worth picking up. But, that's where I was really focused. And so, as your interests go in and out in the hobby, some days I'm looking for Cole books or Schomburg books, and then some days I might be really into some variant covers, like Miles Morales, Spider-Gwen, just cool. I was in my Sandman phase for a little bit earlier last year, so that's just things happen like that. You just get into a certain phase and you're looking for certain books. Because you're interested in a character or a story or whatever it is, and I've always been interested in the variants, and I don't want the standard cover because I just feel like it's a hedge for me. It's like I'd rather have a little bit more of the rare cover than the standard cover, but I've really morphed in the last 2 years in variant comic book collecting. Um, you know, what I've looked at today, and I'll talk about it, as part of this video, is one is, how do you determine, what variant comics to collect, right? If you're a variant comic book collector, right? It could be as simple as character or artist, right? You want all Stephanie Hahn's books or Peach Momoko, and that's what you're going for. Simple. Or all Spider-Man, or Miles Morales covers. That's simple. But, for most people, it's not quite that simple. But yeah, there's a lot of considerations. But last year, when I was doing a lot of variant covers, I was doing, kind of my top 5 every month. It dawned on me that, the covers that were unique, and I say, the covers that didn't have a Virgin variant, I think DC's doing this like big text, little text, I forget what they call them, versions where, you get, trade dress, large and small or something like that. I don't know. Where they just have different size fonts on the front of the cover. It just got kind of silly. It's the same artwork done multiple ways. And so one of the things I do look for now is variant covers that have, only one version if I can, find it and if I really like the art. And that's the other piece too, is I really like certain artists and certain styles of art. Mark Brooks is really growing on me as a new artist I've started to pick up. But, Stephanie Hahn, Jenny Fruzan, even some Peach Momoko, obviously Campbell and Hughes, were the classic artists from when the variant movement really picked up steam, and I call it round 2. Past the comic book crash era, round 2, Campbell and Hughes were really leading that charge, in my opinion. Michael Turner, those guys, right? So how do I look at it now? Because here's like a YouTube search where you're seeing, are variants hurting the hobby? Are they bad for the hobby? Are they negative for the hobby? I think, for some things, I would say yes. If I immediately get turned off if a book has like 40 variants. I remember Marvel does it for Incredible Hulk 1 that came out just recently, or earlier this year or last year, I forget now. But it had a ton of variants, and some were cool. Like there was a Joe Jusko variant. There were some cool variants, but it just turned me off because it was just like it's a sea of variants that people get lost in, and then too much of everything means nothing is really cool. And that's how I viewed some of those variants. So I started looking for unique variants, one of a kind variants. They only exist in one form, and just artwork I like. And that's really where I've been. And, I'm looking for things that appeal to me. I kind of, make me want to, have a visceral reaction to the cover, to the artist, to the subject on the front. And then there's the pragmatic side of me that thinks about value. And so, yeah, I do think about, will this comic book, if I'm going to pay $200 for it, keep its value? And that is something that, from a variant comic book collecting, that's always been there. I mean, if you go back, so I go to one of the first threads I ever remember going on CGC's forum, and, go here. And if you're on CGC, you probably heard of J-Dog Rules. He's a old school guy. But in 2016, when this thread started, and the thread is most valuable modern variants, and he ranks them. And if you go through this first ranking, he talks about some of the rules and no blank covers and all that stuff. But, he goes into the top 12. I don't know why it was 12, but it was 12. But there's Amazing Spider-Man 688. There is Spider-Man 700 of the Ditko, 1 in 200, which nowadays there's 1 in 2000s. There's, but this is I call this almost the golden age of the second round of variant cover collecting, when you had the Delato books and the Saga RRPs and the Walking Dead Lucille. And these were, even, big books then. Some of these have really fallen off. Siege 3 is still up there. The RRP Batman is always obviously still up there. But again, you see a lot of these books that are still very popular, like the 667 Delato. Obviously, that's the king of variant books now, and it was then too. But back in 2016, 6 years ago when this thread was created, the value, and so all these are basically based on value, right? And then you get a lot of people, really having a lot of conversation. I believe this thread is almost like 100. It's 99 pages long, so there's obviously a lot of interest in this, and the thread's still going on. In fact, I think if you go to the last page of the thread, you'll see that I think there was people responding. Yeah, there was a people responding, just a couple of days ago, and you see that J Dog Rule still, talks in the thread, and so it's just like it's an active thing that people are still talking about, and you talk about Clone Wars #1. I think Silver Edition or whatever, SE, should be in there. I mean, you just see people are still highly interested, in the price of variant comics. And I think that's why it's been such polarizing in the comic book industry and collecting circles, as, how just expensive the variants have gotten. And value becomes an issue, because when I first started collecting variants, there was this idea around numbers, and I'll get into the numbers in just a second. Just kind of this interesting to see, like, someone saying like Dark Danger Girl 2, the Ruby Red variant, the Dark Knight 3 Jim Lee sketch version. I mean, Clone Wars Special Edition, not Silver Edition, Special Edition Clone Wars 1, Ultimate Fallout, which has moved into that top space now, but the Delato is still there, 667. So again, I think 678 Mary Jane, which is, I actually have that book. I actually sold my Wolverine 1 Deadpool last year to finance some other stuff. So yeah, I mean, I've had some of these really big books, right? And I still have a few of them in my collection still. And I think you can just see that this is still a major thing for people to talk about. Now, this thread, if you want to go on to it, does a really, really good job of explaining the rarity of the books in terms of this. I actually saw some YouTube videos about variant comics and the idea of, like, let's just go into this this hypothetical that there's 10,000 books published. So that's for a DC or Marvel book, that's on the low side, let's say, or medium to low for, I guess, nowadays. And you've got this idea that you've got this kind of medium to low print run book. Let's say there's a new character, and then they printed, let's say, 2 variants. They did a 1 in 25 and a 1 in 100. So you got 10,000 books, and so you were saying, like, well, the print run would be, this is, people think this, that, okay, well, there's 10,000 copies, so there's going to be 2,500 1 in 25s and 1,000 1 in 100s, and if you look at it, you go, well, or would it be like, I'm trying to think now, or like 100, sorry, like 100, 1 in 1, 1 in 100s, and 250 1 in 25s, right? You sit there and go, like, or no, I was right. Yeah, sorry. We'll cut that out. The math side of it's failing me right now. So 3, 2, 1. So let's say hypothetically there's a book that there's 10,000 copies, right? And you do a 1 in 25 and a 1 in 100 variant, and a lot of people think that means that, well, there's 2,500 of the 1 in 25 and 1,000 1 in 100s, and what you really find out, that's not really the case. And the reason why it's not the case is because that's not how publishing works. There's minimum amounts of books they can print for a lot of these publishers, And what happens is they print, let's say, the minimum amount, and for the 1 in 100s, and I think there's numbers out there for the minimums for certain printers and certain types of printing. But the idea is like, they all get printed, and then at the time for a lot of these books, especially the older books, Diamond would send out to anyone who qualified for those variants if they met the minimum order quantity, the 25. So if you ordered 100 books, you got one of the 100s and 4 of the 25s, and the rest of your books, and everything was good. Everything that was left over was stored at Diamond, and then sporadically they would blow those books out in these kind of like dealer sales. And I mean, there's been, if you search for that, you'll see that sometimes they would sell off their back inventory. They would offer a list of books that you could just buy. And a lot of the time those variants were there. And this is the reason why the Five Below, when the Five Below books and the variants started hitting, and you saw somewhat with the Walmart recently, the variants that were there, it's because these distributors of comic books have all these books in their warehouse, and when they're asked to create these, multi-packs or whatever, they pull from their inventory of books that, were never distributed, and a lot of them are variants that were never given out. And so that's why those print runs are just not those percentages. They are not 1 in 25, and not 1 in 100. They're whatever the minimum print order was for some of those books, and some of them are going to be higher than others. So, like, obviously you'll print more of the 1 in 25 if it's a big print run, and less of the 1 in 100s. But, what's distributed is very questionable, and that's where things got gray. And that's why, for a little bit of time, I kind of quit really doing some of the high-end variants, because the question of what's been printed, what's been released, it's very unknown. I think back in the earlier times, like the Del Auto Spider-Man era, I think those variants were destroyed. I don't think they just kept them. I think there wasn't as many outlets. There wasn't Walmart. There wasn't Five Below. There wasn't avenues to get rid of those variants. So I think those were just pulped and destroyed. Now, I think at some point the variants definitely got out of the warehouse, and obviously sometimes they appear on these lists that dealers can buy from. I just think that at some point the variants became easier, or there was more of them than previously. I just put it that way. Now, today, I think the modern publishers are probably going to do a much better job of controlling these variants from getting out into the public in these repacks and these other special packs, so that we don't have to worry about these 1 in 1000s and 1 in 2000s, coming out at such a high rate that it destroys their value, or just destroys the confidence in those books being rare. The other thing is, I think the new Spawn, the McFarlane Gunslinger book, or the King Spawn book that he autographed, where he numbered every copy. I think we're going to see numbering, more often in comic books. I think that's a good thing, because with variants, it's kind of took me out of it a little bit from collecting variants, because of that idea that who knows how many was actually really printed, who knows how many are sitting in a warehouse somewhere waiting to be distributed in a repack or sold to a dealer at 10 cents a copy. Who knows? And there is enough of these things happening, getting out into the public, that you can't say it won't happen or it can't happen, because it has happened. And that does kind of erode some confidence. So numbering in comic books, I think, it could be a good thing. Now, the last thing I'm going to talk about a little bit is price. I'm pulling up here is eBay, and I'm looking at comic books worth variants. I'm just searching for the word variant. And then I'm looking at what's been sold over $500. And obviously some of these are, buy it nows or best offers. But the sheer volume of comic books selling for over $500 is just astonishing, that are variants. You can just see that there's just tons of these books now, that in the past, I just don't think you would have this breadth and depth of books over $500. Now, some of these are graded, so the graded price definitely affects them. But that Finch Wonder Woman cover for $5.14. I mean, I remember, that book was not nearly that expensive. That is, and that's not even a 9.8, right? And so you would just see, this Punisher, photo variant for $500. I mean, you're just seeing book after book, of comic books that, beforehand, weren't to me like books that I would have thought would be $500, $1,000. There's an $800 Stegman Hulk #6. I mean, just go through the list, and the Pacelli Miles Morales variants. It seems to me like there's 20 Pacelli variants of Miles Morales books worth $500 or more. It's just like there's so many of them. Hip hop variants now are getting more expensive. You've got the Anti-Venom second print cover for $600 raw. I mean, just, a lot of books are worth a lot of money, and not just $500. I mean, you've got the Peach Momoko for $1,500 there, $8,000 for the, Miles Morales 1 in 25 first appearance variant, which is a great book, and that's going to maybe overtake that, 667 Spider-Man one day as being the #1 variant ever made. But it's just so many, Strange Academy 1 Opina variant for $617 raw. It's so many variants worth over $500 that, Agents of Alice, $1,600. I mean, just so many of them, right? And I think that, to me, if I was going to say the danger, right? So when you're paying, like, if a book's $4 and you're paying, for 25 copies of them, so you're paying $100 for that book, or you're paying $400 for a 1 in 100, you're just paying the cover price times the ratio. That's, to me, like, obviously too much. I would probably never do that for a lot of these books, and that's not what a lot of these books go for. But that's sort of the rationale behind some of the pricing, back in the day. But as we're looking at it, it's getting closer and closer to that. And I think the pricing side of it is that there's so many variants worth so much money. So if you think about it, there's got to be just a ton of money pouring into the hobby and from collectors to keep these variants so high and selling so frequently, that amongst so many books, that it either speaks to two things. One, there's a lot of people who love variants who are willing to pay a lot of money for the cool ones, the rare ones. And two, there's collectors out there for a lot of characters and artists that want the rare stuff and are willing to pay for it. So that's great. I think that is healthy and going to make this hobby, have some legs, because in all honesty, with comic book collecting, one of the reasons why modern comic book collecting is fun for me and not fun for me is this. There's very few mechanisms for a comic book to go up in value, other than a first appearance or a cool cover or a rarity of the book. Just, it's hard to find for other reasons. Maybe it's an error, maybe just very low print run. But there's very little ways for the book to just be worth a lot of money other than these, rare art, cover art. And the good thing, the cool and bad thing is you could take any comic book, any issue, assign it to Hughes, Campbell, Fruzan, Hans. They put together a great cover, and bam, you got something that could be great. And the issue itself is meaningless. Like there's nothing in that issue that matters but the cover. And that, I think the purists, is what they really don't like. They think, you're just collecting art, but to me, that's what appeals about it. It's rare, and the art's great, and people look at the cover as being one of the biggest factors in whether or not they want to buy the book. So I think, it's got its good things and bad things. The really bad thing is that it's very shallow and it's very subjective. Peach Momoko has gotten so overpublished that I think a lot of her covers are coming out worth less than they would have 2 years ago. And I think that can happen. People get tired of the same style of art, so they look for something a little different. And so when it's that subjective, there's nothing holding the value up other than just opinion. That's a little bit more tenuous. But, I got a couple books here, like I just picked up the Delato, book, worth like there's 1,000 of these supposedly, and it's only worth like 15, $20. But then you've got this amazing Ginny Frizon 1 in 100 Sandman book, and it's selling $350, $400 recently, and it's because the cover art is of a subject that's very popular, doesn't have a ton of great comic book covers, and Ginny Frizon's art is really good on that cover. Delato is awesome, and that Spider-Man book is great too, but it's $20 versus 400. And to a lot of people, I think some people would say they like the Delato cover better than they like the Frizon cover. They don't like Sandman. They don't like Death. They love Spider-Man. So why is it such a big spike difference in price? And I think the only thing that you can say is it's just it's public opinion. It's when the books do go up, you see this kind of like piling on effect where people just don't want to miss out. The FOMO becomes a little bit there, and then that book a lot of times goes back down in price a little bit. So again, that's for me, collecting and why I collect variants is very simple. I want something that's a little bit more rare. I do think collecting comic book variants will eventually boil down to, in the future, that I think you're going to see more of these numbered or more guaranteed rare books. I think autograph books right from the publisher, like the Berserker, Keanu Reeves, the Todd McFarlane autographs are going to be much more common. And there's going to be kind of a pivot to guaranteed scarcity to make these books have I call it like, that built-in scarcity to prop up the values. But again, this is all a very subjective field, and I think that's what makes people a little nervous about variants, is that all it takes is the artist becoming out of favor or saying something on Twitter or whatever, and then all of a sudden prices could tumble. It's so subjective, and I think that's the one thing that makes comic book variants so hard to recommend to people in terms of as a major investment. I would just say this: if you love the artist, if you love the art, you love the subject matter, you can't really go wrong, because having cool covers of your favorite character from your favorite artist is always a great thing as a collector. And it's the only reason I collect Schomburg books, the only reason I collect L.B. Cole books, is because I love the art. So it won't be bad to look at your comic book collection and just love the artwork that you've collected. And if the value stays there, that's great. If it sometimes goes low, okay. But that to me is what we should be doing. But I understand when you're paying $400 for what I consider to be the best Sandman Death cover, you kind of have to consider that. Should I pay $400 now or wait till it goes down? Those are things that you have to kind of ask yourself, because no one has infinite money, and you have to make those choices. So, but there it is. That's my take on why I collect variants, and just kind of what I think what's going to happen to variants in the future. And I'll always be showing variants in my comic book mail days. I just posted one, so please check it out and let me know what you think, and I'll see you next time on Cards and Comics. Bye.